Hey folks, John here, Old Hickory Forge. Welcome back. If it's your first time here, welcome. So, what's going on today? I'm out here in the workshop and we're getting moving on the Samurai Challenge. So there have been a few of these YouTube build-off challenges. You know, we've done a Bowie knife challenge, a fantasy challenge, a chopper challenge. It's a great honor to be invited to compete, and I'm super excited about the project. And the theme with this project is samurai. So that basically any samurai weaponry is fair game. You know, you could do a dagger, a sword, a polearm, or anything like that. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be making a KATANA. I don't actually know how to pronounce it. You know, one of you weebs correct me in the comments. First things first, if you're looking for a traditional katana build, this ain't it. I'm not going to be using Tamahagane, traditional Japanese bloom steel, because I don't have the time, I don't have the skill. We're just going to be sticking with what we know and making the sword out of Damascus, because that's going to produce a functional and beautiful blade. And I am going to kind of poke fun throughout the video and mispronounce things, because there is no sword that is more romanticized in Western pop culture than the katana. There is a very large and vocal cohort of people who will look you dead in the eye with a straight face and tell you that a katana is some kind of magic super sword that can chop through a tank. But anyway, let's get started. I'm actually filming this after the fact because I forgot to put it in the first time. But huge thanks to all the challenge sponsors, and here is a peek at the finished sword. If you want to see how I made it, stick around. As always, first step with Damascus, we've gone ahead and cleaned up all our steel. We have our 1084 and our 15N20. That's what makes the pattern in Damascus steel, is it's actually made of two different kinds of steels. And what I want to do for the pattern is something called ladder Damascus. I just think that's going to look really good with kind of the long flowing curve of the blade. To show you what I'm talking about, you know, here's a knife that I made some time ago using the same technique. That one's about 200 layers. And from my understanding, the higher you go with the layer count, the kind of more activity there's going to be in the blade. So this one, we're going to be aiming for a little over 1,000 layers. We're starting with 32, so we're going to forge weld that together, draw it out, cut it in half, restack it, and do that 5 times, and that should get us where we need to go. But the first thing we got to do is go ahead and weld all this stuff together and weld on our work pick so we can hold it with a pair of tongs. Nothing to it, really. So we got our billet tacked together with the welder. Before we bring it up to a nice white hot forge welding heat, we're just going to get it a little warm and then sprinkle on our flux. We're just using borax here, and what this does is kind of melts onto the surface of the steel and keeps oxygen out so our steel stays nice and clean for the forge weld. Once this is done, we'll get it back in the fire, crank things up, and bring it up to a nice white hot forge welding heat and be good to go. Nice and hot, give it a good squish. Second weld, here we go. Just trying to kind of consolidate my material now. Alright, we got our billet forged out, so now it's time to go ahead and cut it in half and restack it to double the layer count. First thing we got to do is grind one side flat so we got clean welding surfaces. And this is a great opportunity to take this new surface grinder attachment I got for my 2x72 for a spin. House-made industrial, the same folks who designed this grinder kit, you know, came out with this tool. It's a pretty high-speed bit of kit. It's got a magnetic chuck and it slides back and forth, so it's going to be a lot faster and take all the guesswork out of making things flat. So once our welding surfaces are nice and clean, we've basically just done the same thing as before. We've tacked the billet back together, got our work peg welded on, and we'll forge weld this together. That'll give us 64 layers, and we'll do that 4 more times, and that'll get us a little over 1,000. I'm going to kind of glance over this because it doesn't really get interesting until we actually go to make the ladder pattern. While that billet's cooling off in between forge welds, I'm going to go ahead and start working on the new sword quench tank. I told myself before I made another sword, I'd build an actual sword quenching tank. You know, I've been using that tank ammo tube, and it works, but there's a slow leak. You know, they're actually not solid on the bottom whenever you get them, and you have to kind of jerry-rig it. And over the past few years, mine's just developed a slow leak, and it's time to make a better one. So before we go any further with the sword quench tank project, I've gone ahead and poured it full of water to see how much quench oil I'm going to need to buy, and also to check if the welds are watertight, which as you can see, they are not. So we're going to have to do a little bit of remedial action to that, and we'll keep moving. On account of my welds not being watertight, I've brought it to somebody who actually knows what they're doing. My good buddy Andrew of WNC Metalworks. I'll link his Instagram down below if you want to give him a follow. He's just getting started going into business for himself, doing welding, fabrication, all kinds of cool stuff, and he's a much better welder than me, and he can actually do this. So we're going to let him do his thing. Alright, so all the forge welding took a couple of days, but here we got a billet that is approximately 1,000 layers of pattern welded steel. We got about 34 inches of length, it's 1 3/8 inches wide and about 3/8 of an inch thick. And the next step is to go ahead and press in the pattern to make the ladder Damascus. And to actually make the pattern, we're going to be using our Gerard Forge and Tool ladder Damascus dies. I'll drop a link to his Instagram down below. You know, he's a buddy of mine, excellent machinist. He made these for me. Basically, the idea with ladder Damascus is you either press grooves into your billet and then grind it flat, or you grind grooves in and then forge it flat. Either way, the goal is essentially to bring all the wavy layers to the surface and create that ripple effect in the steel that we're looking for. And if we overforge the billet here, it's basically ruined. So what I've done is taken a couple of pieces of 1/4 inch square to use as kiss blocks to keep from pressing this thing too thin. And let's get moving. We got all our ridges pressed in. Once this bore is ground flat, that's what's going to cut through all the layers and create the ladder effect in the steel we're looking for. Hopefully with good sharp belts this won't take too long, but it probably will. So that actually didn't take too terribly long using good sharp belts. If you're wondering why I didn't just use the surface grinder attachment I was using to face off the billets in between forge welding, it's just because it's not long enough. It's only got a travel of about 18 inches and this is just way too big. So the next thing we're going to do, I was hoping to have enough to just go straight stock removal from here because any forging we do is going to distort the pattern. But it's not quite long enough. I want to try to pull a little bit more length out of it. So we're going to go back to the power hammer, kind of bring the width in. We might have to actually forge in the distal taper or the blade too to get the length we're looking for. We also got the sword forge pulled out, so it'll be easy to get a good long consistent heat. And let's get moving. Moving the steel around a little bit, we got just over 40 inches of material to work with, which that's good. We can pretty much go straight stock removal from here, so I'm going to let this cool and lay out my lines for what's going to be the tang and what's going to be the blade, and then we'll go from there. Fun fact, Katana, these things, they were made specifically for each warrior who used them and everything, so the blade length was kind of based on how tall you were. I'm 6'2", so between a 30 and a 32-inch blade would have been historically what they would have made for me if I was one of them. So we've got about 30 inches, I think, maybe 31, and then about 10 or so to make the tang. Then, once we've got the rough profile ground in, we'll do what's called the sori. Sori, I don't know. Somebody tell me how it's pronounced in the comments. But basically what that is the curvature of the sword, and this is kind of a matter of personal preference from the exhaustive 5 minutes of Googling I've done to figure out what it was. So I want just kind of a gentle flowing curve, so we're just going to kind of eyeball it. Another fun fact, historically, the curve of the sword happens during the hardening process when they put the clay on the back of the blade to differentially harden it. That part cools much, much slower, and it kind of pulls the thinner steel of the edge back. But since this is Damascus and we're not doing that, we're going to forge in the curve before the quench. Nothing to it, really. So I cleaned up one end of our billet and just did a quick test etch to kind of give you a sneak peek at the pattern. Pretty stinking cool. Once this is taken up the grits and polished out, it's going to be really, really nice. So I bought this book, The Art of the Japanese Sword, to kind of try to help me get my bearings before I got started on this project. And there's some pretty good info in here, you know, about blade shapes and geometry and all that. So I kind of have just been looking at it to kind of get some inspiration. I think I like this shape the best, so that's kind of something like I'm going for. So I got my lines laid out on my billet, and we're going to go to the grinder and just kind of rough in the shape of the sword. So, profile of the sword is established. Next thing to do is go ahead and forge in the sori, the curvature of the sword. And like I said, I'm just going to kind of eyeball this. I don't have too much of a plan. I'm just going to kind of curve it until I feel like it looks right. And from there, we're going to normalize the sword 3 times and go straight into our quench. I've already got my quench tank posted up. You know, doing all the grinding after heat treat is going to kind of suck and take a long time. But the thinner we make those edges, the more likely we are to have warps or cracking or what have you during the hardening process. So this is going to maximize our chances of success. I've only got one of these billets and I'll have time to make another one, so wish me luck. Happy with the curvature of the sword, so now I'm just trying to go through and make sure everything's straight before we do our normalizing and get it quenched. Nothing to it really. Next step is to go ahead and normalize the blade a few times before we quench it. To do that, we need a consistent even heat over the whole blade of about 1500 degrees or so. And to get that, I'm using a technique called painting the heat, where I'm basically just passing the sword in and out of the forge nice and slow. This is how you heat treat a blade that's longer than your forge. But once I get a heat I'm happy with, I'll sit it in the vise facing up to cool off and let it cool in still air on its own. You don't want to lay it flat on your anvil or the floor or anything like that, because if one side cools faster than the other, you know, it could end up warping on you during the quench, and you just want to avoid that if you can. Nothing to it really. Alright, here we go, boys. Wish me luck. So that was a pretty ugly quench. I really should have been holding the blade from the side, and I did mean to do that, but you know, quenching a sword, no matter how many times you do it, it's always nerve-wracking, and once I started going for the oil, there was no turning back. So it just is what it is. But let's pull it out of there and see how we did. Looks like we made it through the quench, boys. The sword is nice and straight as well. You know, that's the main reason I left it so thick before heat treating, was I didn't want to deal with any warping or cracking or anything like that. Right now, the blade is very brittle. If I took it and smacked it on the anvil, it would break. So the next thing we got to do is temper it. Basically, what tempering does is it kind of relieves the stresses that quenching puts into the steel, makes it a little bit softer, a little bit tougher. Normally, with small knives or whatever, you'll just toss it in the oven at like 400 or 450 for however long, depending on the intended use of the blade and how hard or soft you want the steel. For the sword, you know, I can't fit this thing in my kitchen oven, so we're going to be doing a hot oil bath. So I've got my quench tank set up on a little turkey fryer right here, and we're going to put a thermocouple in there. We're going to heat the oil up to about 400, 450 or so and hold it there for about an hour, hour and a half, and that should give us a good, strong blade. It goes without saying, obviously, heating up a reservoir full of flammable liquid with an open flame in a shop full of explosive gases is pretty dangerous, but I mean, just don't kick the thing over and you'll be okay. And I got a fire extinguisher over here in case anything does go wrong. And I'm going to stay here and babysit it the whole time, so I'm pretty sure it'll be fine. Alright, so once we got the oil up to temp, we started a timer for an hour and a half, so the sword's good and tempered at this point. One thing I do want to touch on, you see how high the oil in the tank is? The oil expands quite a bit when it's heated, and that's something you need to take into account if you're going to do something like this, like building a sword quench tank and doing hot oil baths. Because when I got started, there was over a foot of headspace here, and now there's just a few inches. And if that boils over and catches fire, you're going to be having a really, really bad time. So, but anyway, tomorrow morning, we'll pull that guy out of there, and we'll get to work grinding on it. Now you see how much lower the fluid level is now that the oil is cooled off, so that's something you need to take into account if you're going to build one of these. Now that the sword's been through the heat treating process, it's been hardened and tempered, we're ready to start grinding. This is where we'll start establishing the blade geometry, and it'll actually start to look like a sword instead of just a sword-shaped bar of steel. Because we heat treated this thing really thick, we've got quite a ways to go. Luckily, I just got a resupply of 36 grit belts in, so that should make relatively quick work of it, but we're still going to be in front of the grinder for quite a while. We'll be starting doing the back bevel or spine of the sword, which is called the mune or the moon or something like that. And the geometry that I want to go for is something like this one here on the far left. I like this one the best, so we'll get started on that. You got the Muni roughed in, it's time to start worrying about the geometry of the blade. What we got here are two different bevels, which are called the Shinogi and the G, and the medial ridge that runs in between the two is called the Shino Guy Joe or something like that. So basically, we have to keep that line even all the way up and down the curved surface of the blade. You know, it's an interesting geometry. There's no flats anywhere like you would see on some other swords and knives and things like that. Basically, you've got your back bevel, your medial bevel, and your front bevel. So it's going to be challenging keeping everything straight and in line and even as we go, but we'll see what happens. So here we are for the 2x72 after just a few solid hours of work, which is honestly way less than I thought it was going to take, but with good sharp belts and the 2 horsepower sander, it made relatively quick work of it. We didn't find any inclusions in the steel. There's no cracks that happened during heat treating that I can see. Quick sidebar, whenever I got the chance to visit the Met in New York City, if you've never been, it's totally worth checking out. But they had a pretty extensive collection of Japanese historical swords and knives and things. And a lot of them had, visible inclusions in the surface, and some of them even had like messed up holes drilled in the tang and things like that. So even the fabled master Japanese swordsmiths of old made mistakes. We're all human and so on. All that being said, I'm really, really happy with the way this thing is coming along. Considering that I just ground this by hand and by eye, I didn't use any jigs, I didn't lay out any lines. I just kind of went forward and let my hands tell me what to do. All the lines are very crisp, very straight. The Shinogi is almost perfectly even, all the way up and down. There's a few little ripples here and there, but we're well within what hand sanding is going to fix at this point. It's lightening up really good. It's feeling good. It's a teeny tiny bit front heavy, but from what I understand, katana were kind of supposed to be like that. They don't have anywhere near as much of a distal taper as you see on European swords. It's more or less the same thickness all the way up and down. And, for its intended purpose, the cutting ability of a katana is kind of the star of the show when it comes to the sword. So, like, if you were a samurai who was cutting down peasants because they looked at you wrong, or if you were a Japanese soldier at Nanking in 1938 cutting down Chinese civilians because they looked at you wrong, don't worry about it, though. The Japanese government's going to deny it even happened, and you'll never get in any trouble or anything like that. But if you were one of those guys, having that little forward heavy slicing capability would come in pretty handy. So, sword's coming along great. I can't resist. Let's do a test etch and take a peek at the pattern. So this is just after a quick 1-minute dip in the acid. It's going to pop much, much better once it's hand sanded and polished out, and all these little marks like that are going to be hand sanded out. But already that is looking pretty stinking cool. The camera really doesn't do it justice, and you can really kind of see the way the layers play with the light. Almost creates the illusion of movement. That is a beautiful piece of steel, boys. The first fitting we got to make for the sword is the habako, this thing. Anyway, it's a collar that kind of acts as the ricasso on a Japanese sword, so we have to make a piece out of copper and basically fit it to the tang of the sword and then solder in another little piece of copper so it kind of brings it all together. I've never soldered anything before in my life, so hopefully this all works out. First thing, we got to anneal the piece of copper we want to use to make the habaki. Copper is kind of the opposite of steel. Whenever you heat it up and quench it, rather than harden, it actually softens, and that's what we're trying to accomplish here. And now it should be real easy to work by hand. So I've made 2 little marks that roughly match the thickness of the sword, so that's going to end up being the back of the habaki. And these bits on either side are going to be kind of forged out into lobes, so they're thinner than the back, and it'll all be bent around and then soldered together. You get the idea. So you see what we got going? We have the lugs forged down to approximately half the thickness of the parent bar. Next thing is to drive this down with a punch and start forming this thing around and then forming it to the tang of the sword. Nothing to it, really. Alright, so my first habaki went in the trash. We learned a lot about how to not solder, so this here's take 2. I'm not going to sit here and film every attempt because I don't know how long this is going to take. Luckily, we got plenty of copper, so if we got to remake this thing 1,000 times, we can do it. But let's keep moving, and we'll come back when it's done. So, that really sucked. I've been chasing my tail with this thing for 2 days now. This is the 6th habaki I've made, and it's the first one that's actually, you know, kind of held together. The soldering job looks pretty awful, but it's in one piece, and at that point I'm just going to have to take that and run with it because I got to keep moving on the sword. I don't have time to keep chasing my tail. If I finish the build and I have time to circle back and make a new one, I will, because something that's kind of cool about the katana, it's not held together with any glue or anything like that. It's just held together with a pin, so you can take the sword apart pretty easily and replace pieces. So if I have time to make a new habaki, I will, but this one's functional, and that's just you know, a win we're just going to have to take and run with. I'm not even going to show me struggling with making this thing because it made me look like a straight-up moron. If you want to know how to make a habaki, watch literally any other one of the channels who are participating in this challenge, and chances are they're going to be better at it than I am. But anyway, let's keep moving. Now that we got a functional habako on the sword, next thing we got to start worrying about is this piece right here. I don't think it actually has a name. I think it's just called the circle. And on either side of the circle, there is little spacers that are called seppos. So we're just going to make those out of some thin sheet metal right quick, and then we'll start going after this thing. Alright, so the spacers are done. All we did to finish them was we ran them through the forge, you know, got them hot, and then dunked them in some boiled linseed oil to get a nice soft black. So now it's time to get to work on the suba, the guard, you know, the circle-shaped deal. So what I've done, I've cut out a square of this pretty masculine piece of 1/4-inch plate, found the center, drilled a few holes, and we're just going to file out the slot for the tang like we've been doing, you know, nothing to it really. The suba of the katana is often decorated, sometimes very elaborately, and I would like to at least do some basic file work to the edges. We'll see how much time I have when I'm done. We're going to circle back to this after we get all the structural parts of the sword done, and you know, I have a little more time to play with. So the next thing we're going to go ahead and do is start making the handle. I got some poplar. I've already traced out the line of the tang, and we're just going to go through and cut that out until it fits onto the sword. I'm not much of a woodworker. The only chisels I have are these crappy, you know, hazard fraught chisels that I haven't used in some years. So we'll sharpen them up and see what we can do. So we got the slots for the tang carved out. The sword fits in there real nice. So the next step is to go ahead and glue the two halves of the handle together. Used way too much glue and made a huge mess, but I mean, if that's the worst thing that goes wrong with the rest of this project, I'd say we did pretty good, boys. So it's the next day. The two halves of our handle block are glued up real nice. There's a little bit of slop to it, so the next thing we're going to do is a little knife maker's trick called bedding the tang. So basically, we're just going to mix up some epoxy and then pour it into our tang slot. And then we'll take the tang of the sword as well as the bottom of the bolster or what have you, and basically anything we don't want to stick. We're going to give a nice generous coating of Vaseline. And what will happen is the epoxy will dry and essentially create a negative of the tang on the inside. So it's going to fit nice and solid. There will be no wiggle, no slop. And the handle will go on and off the same way each time. You know, it's a trick that bladesmiths use for making hidden tang knives, so it's a neat little thing to know. Alright boys, we had a bit of a time last night. Apparently I didn't do a very good job bedding the tang. Whenever I put the Vaseline on, I must not have covered it completely because the tang actually stuck in there pretty badly. And I had to beat it with a hammer to get it off, and I ruined the seppa and broke the habaki and had to make new ones. But it's on there, it's fitting nice and tight. It's a little bit out of center, but we got plenty of material there to work with, so it's not a big deal. Let's make a handle. So, we got the wooden core of the handle shaped out. It's looking good, it's feeling good. You know, the sword indexes really well. So the next step is to go ahead and get some stingray leather on this guy. This here is our stingray skin. I've had it soaking in warm water overnight, so it's nice and pliable. We'll cut out the piece we need, wrap it around the handle, tie it on there with some rubber bands, and then let it dry so it forms to the handle. I've never actually wrapped a sword handle before, so, you know, wish me luck. Once the race skin is dry, we'll go through and cut off the excess. I gave myself a lot of extra material because I'm not sure exactly how much this is going to shrink as it dries out. But once it's dry, it'll hold that shape, so we'll go through, trim off the excess. Make sure the seam is going to be on this side because that's going to be completely covered by the Edo wrap. Like I said, I've never wrapped a sword handle before, so I'm sure the seam isn't going to come out perfect, and that'll kind of hide any imperfections. But I'm going to leave this till tomorrow, and let's get to work hand sanding the blade. Obviously, this is going to take a while. We're starting off with 80 grit to remove any imperfections from grinding. The Trizac belts do a pretty good job of getting all the deep gouges out, though, so we don't have a whole lot of work to do here. But we'll start with 80 grit, and then we'll get it up to 600. You know, nothing to it, really. Alright, so the Stingray skin is glued onto the wooden core of the handle. That's drying inside. We've gone ahead and finished sanded the blade. It's sanded up to 800 grit on both sides. We've gone ahead and polished out the hibachi. So let's see if we can make a scabbard for this thing. Alright, so we got the channel for the sword carved out of the wooden thing that holds the sword. I got it gluing up. Got a whole slew of clamps on it in the vise. The sword fits in there pretty stinking good, actually. The seal up here around the habaki is nice and tight, you know, not a whole lot of play in it at all. So hopefully once that's dry, we can shape it out into something that looks nice and feels nice. Now, making this, I was quickly reminded why I became a blacksmith instead of a woodworker. You know, my chisel work on the inside of this looks pretty stinking terrible, and there were more than a few spots where I probably gouged a little too deep. So hopefully we can shape this thing out without grinding through it and having to start over. After getting the saya finished, sanded to where I like it, I went ahead and made the kirigata, I believe it's called. I forgot to finish sand it before I glued it on, so we'll just have to do that later. It's not that big a deal. I just used the same poplar that the Scabbard's made out of. But while that's drying, we're going to get to work on the Suba. I've been racking my brain trying to decide how it was I wanted to decorate the circle guard thing. And what I've come up with, rather than do it all out of one piece and carve out a bunch of slots and spend forever drilling and filing, we're going to fabricate this thing. So I made this little jig out of a piece of scrap pipe I had laying around. We're going to bend some 1/4 inch round around that. We're going to remove all the material except for this little bit that fits onto the tang of the sword. And then we'll make a bunch of these little curved spokes and weld all that together, and I think that's going to look really, really cool. See what we got going. We got the inner piece, we got the outer ring made, and we're starting to make these little spokes. I tried a few different ways to kind of curve them and make them look, you know, a little more dramatic, but there's just not enough space there for any amount of curve to really be super visible. So we're just going to make straight spokes and try to get as many in there as we can. Nothing to it, really. This thing may look like straight hammered dog crap right now, but you know, once we show it some love, flatten it out, grind off all the welds, needle file out all the crap between the spokes, and then blacken it in the forge, I think it's going to look right snazzy. So here's the Suba, you know, all done. It's far from perfect, but if you gave me the choice between drinking my entire slack tub and filing out another one of these, I'm going to drink the slack tub, so it's just going to have to be okay. Let's keep moving. And of course, you know, it's pretty out of center. It doesn't got to be perfect, but it's got to be better than that. So unfortunately, we are going to have to start over on that piece. I'm going to circle back to that once all the rest of the sword is done, just so I can, you know, really give it my full attention. What happened, I think, the center punch mark I started when I found the center of the billet I used to make the Suba. I used that, I kind of matched that up with the apex of the blade, not taking into account that one bevel is much longer than the other, and that's what's led it to be like this. So that's a real rookie mistake on my part and something I should have thought about. But anyway, like I said, we'll circle back to that. Let's keep moving. Before we circle back to making a new Suba, I want to go ahead and completely finish the rest of the sword handle so that once that's done, the sword's ready to put together. The next things we need to make are the Fuchi and the Kashira. I'm running out of ideas for how to creatively mispronounce things, so we're just going to ditch that going forward. You know, it was fun while it lasted. But the top piece, the Fuchi, is essentially a collar that goes around the top of the handle. Blade's going to go through here. So we've gone ahead and formed up a collar out of sheet metal, tacked on another piece. We'll grind this out till they match, and then we got to drill and file it out so the blade sits through here. The process on the bottom end is pretty similar, and I'm not sure if I'm going to do it different yet because I think a little bit of doming Might look cool on it, but let's just go for it and see what happens, boys. We got the Fuji done. I went with the same sort of black oxide finish I've been doing on the other steel fittings. Now we got to make the kashira. You can kind of see, you know, how the sword's going to come together now. So slowly but surely. All right, boys. Yesterday was kind of a fail as far as shop time goes. You know, we found out we're going to need to remake the Tsubo. We spent half the day finishing. My plan for doing the kashira out of 2 pieces is just not going to work. We're going to need to make a special top and bottom die set to pull that out of 1 piece, and I'm still not entirely sure how I'm going to do that. So while I gather my thoughts, I'm going to keep moving on the saya. The last piece we need to make for it is the collar that goes up here. It's called the koiguchi, I believe. Basically, it's a collar that's kind of recessed onto the saya that matches, you know, the hole in the front and everything. It's made out of a tougher material, usually like horn or copper, and its function is to help keep the saya together, as well as protect the hand of the wielder on a draw cut. I don't have any horn, and I don't want to deal with making it out of copper, so we're going to be using my micarta, you know, should do the job. I got my lines marked out. I figured I'd take this jeweler's saw that I bought for this project, but I haven't used yet for a spin, so I just drilled a starter hole, threaded the blade through, and now we're just going to go through and pierce it out. Looks like it's actually working pretty good. You know, I thought this would be really slow going, but the micarta is not super difficult to cut, so it's making pretty quick work of it. Good thing I bought like 200 of these blades because they break really, really easily. Turns out using that jeweler's saw actually really sucks. So I drilled a bunch of holes and then went at it with my Hidden Tang handle broach, and then we'll just file that out nice and clean. After a couple hours of filing, we got the koiguchi done. To attach it to the saya, I just flattened both surfaces and then roughed them up and super glued it on there, which isn't the traditional way to do it, but it's plenty strong and it'll work for what we need it for. So the next thing is to go ahead and trim it down until it matches the shape of the saya, finish sand everything, make it all nice and smooth, and then we'll start painting and lacquering it. So now it's time to go ahead and make the tooling that we need to make the kashira. So what I got here, I've dug through my scrap pile and I found this. I think it's a piece of forklift tine. We're going to make the bottom swage out of that. And we need to make 2 top swages. One that we're going to use to make the bottom swage itself. That's going to be slightly larger than the finished dimensions because we have to account for the 16 gauge sheet metal that's going to go between the finished die and the bottom die. And then we'll make the bottom die out of whatever's left of this. And hopefully it works. The idea is that once it's all said and done, we should have an impression here, and we should be able to lay our sheet metal here and drive that top die in and make the whole thing out of 1 piece. So let's see what happens. Our base piece chucked up in the press, and we got the big drip. And we're just going to get that baby started. A little bit of charcoal powder. Our bottom swage is a little bit out of center, but you know, it'll be okay. So now the idea, I think, is we should be able to take this top die that's roughly the same dimensions as our handle, put a piece of sheet metal right here, and press it into that to make the piece we need. So let's heat up some steel and see if it works. After quite a bit of trial and error with this thing, mostly error, I kept having the problem of it shearing through the piece whenever I got close to the bottom. So I brought it over here to the anvil and started doing it by hand, and that seemed to work a lot better. It does seem like our swage isn't quite deep enough for me to pull this whole thing out of 1 piece. I could make a new one, or I could take what I got and run with it, and I think that's what I'm going to do, because what we can do is we can cut that off and then make a collar like we did with the Fuji. And, you know, it's still not exactly what we wanted, but it's a lot better than what we had. Now we're going to take it and go, boys. Alright, so after chasing our tail on the kashira for 2 days, you know, here is what we got. You know, far from perfect, but it's serviceable, it'll do the job, and I can't afford to keep chasing my tail on this 1 piece of the sword when there's still so much that has to happen. So let's get it on the handle. Now that that horrific ordeal of terror is over, next pieces we need to make are the manuki. And what these are little decorative ornaments that go on either side of the handle and are also supposed to help you index grip. And I think just some simple copper leaves are going to look really nice. Chunk of copper, we'll forge this out into a nice thin bar. Then we'll use a texture tool under the press. Here's what I came up with for the manuki. I just textured that whole bar basically and then cut out the pieces I need, domed them out on a spoon swage, and then buffed them up. I was worried they might seem kind of basic because manuki can often be very, very elaborate, But I think they came out really, really stinking nice, so let's keep moving. The final step before we can do the Edo wrap is to drill and file out a slot in the kashira so that when we're done wrapping, we can tie off the end of the cord. A couple things before we get moving on the Edo wrap. First and foremost, I'm not going to be using any Hishigami, which are the little paper spacers that you see people put between the race skin and the Edo cord. Just because I've been practicing with this all day and my hands are killing me, and it just makes it a little bit too unwieldy for me to put together at my current skill level. And, you know, some people say it's necessary, some people say it's not necessary, and at this point, you know, this project's been fighting me every step of the way, and I'm kind of just ready to see it done. Which brings me to my next point. I'm going to be using super glue to help keep everything tightened together as I go, which I know is cheating, so you master swordsmiths, let me have it in the comments. So I'm just slowly working my way down the handle, trying to keep everything tight and lined up as I go. If you actually want to learn how to wrap a katana handle, this is not the video for you because I have no stinking idea what I'm doing. But like I said, I'm just trying to keep everything pulled tight and lined up, and at the you know, apex of each row, I'm just putting a little bead of super glue. It's got a 10-second set time, so I'm going to sit here and hold it, you know, till it is solid. And then I'll turn it over and keep moving. So we just made our way past the first manuki, and, you know, we'll just keep going. All right, fellas, we got the Edo wrap done. For the knot on the bottom that secures it, I was having a hard time following all the diagrams I found online, so I just kind of winged it and put it together in a way that I knew it wasn't going to come apart. Cut off the excess and then hit it with some more super glue, so it's on there good. Also couldn't resist doing a mock-up assembly of the sword. Last big hurdle we got to cross over is remaking this Tsuba. And my plan for remaking the Tsuba, a few people have mentioned that you could peen copper into this and then refile out the slot, and apparently that's not too uncommon on antique Japanese swords. But the more and more I look at this, the less and less happy I am with it, and I feel like I could do better. So we're just going to start with a piece that's a little bit more oversized. We'll drill and file out the slot, and then measure from where the sword actually sits to get it good and centered. Alright, so we got the new Tsuba fitted on and shaped up and everything. That's a million times better than it was. I'm so glad I redid this. But anyway, let's decorate this sucker. Basically, my plan for going after the new Tsuba is I drilled 1/4-inch holes around the perimeter. I drilled 1/8-inch holes right close to the hole for the tang where they'll be covered up by the seppa. And I'm going through with my Dremel with a cutoff wheel and removing the excess. And I don't know why I didn't think of this, because this is way easier and it's going to look a million times better. You know, I don't use my Dremels very often. I kind of forget I have them, but they're pretty great for tasks like this. So this was a stupid idea. This is the way to go. So after drilling and cutting and filing the Tsuba and getting it all done and everything, I just ran it through the forge a few times and then hit it with some beeswax to blacken it. I'm really glad I remade this piece. This looks a million times better. So, you know, lesson learned, but let's keep moving. I went ahead and put my touch mark on the tang. From what I understand, traditionally Japanese swords are signed on the tang. Kind of hard because there's no flat spot anywhere. You know, I had a difficult time getting that stamp. But now comes the good part. We got the blade cleaned, degreased. Let's get it in the acid and check out the pattern. The camera really doesn't do it justice. You know, I tried to find some good indirect sunlight, you know, out here outside. But it's really, really amazing how the pattern catches the light and kind of creates the illusion of movement. That's a real thing of beauty, boys. You know, this is the most rewarding part of pattern welding, in my opinion, is, you know, the acid bath really bringing the steel to life. Last step before the sword is fully functional is to drill through the handle and tang and install the Meikugi pin that's actually going to hold the whole thing together. So I'm just starting with a small drill bit, and I'm going to go really slow, let the bit do the work, don't force it. And to make our Meikugi pin, we got a piece of a chopstick. Nothing to it, really. Alright, we got our Meikugi pin in. It sits a little bit more proud than I would have liked it to. I was hoping it would be closer to flush, but it's beneath the level of the Edo wrap. It's out of the way of your hand, and at this point getting it out would be a huge pain, so I'm going to call that good. So what I got here is what's called a tatami mat. These are what martial artists use to test their swords on. I've had it soaking in water for about a day and a half now. It's pretty crazy how much these things actually harden up. You know, when you get them, they feel like a bundle of dry straw. But once they're soaked, they feel almost like a tree branch. But Supposedly this is supposed to mimic the consistency of a human arm or leg, and it's something that I've read and been told that you absolutely have to have training to be able to cut one with a sword, or you're just not going to be able to. And I have 0 training, but I do have a sword and 15 beers in my stomach, so let's see what happens. Alright, no idea what I'm doing. Oh, baby. Ooh. Haha, cool. Let's try an underhand cut. Wow. Man, dude, that is awesome. Alright, let's try one-handed. Wow. 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 Sweet. Wow. 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 Yeah. Here she is all done. My first ever katana. I had a really great time with this project. I learned a lot, tried a lot of new things, made a lot of mistakes, but I feel like it really broadened my horizons as a maker. And you know, even though I did kind of clown on internet anime weeb culture throughout some of the video, making this sword has given me such a new appreciation for the skill and artistry that actually goes into making these swords. And you know, even though someone like Ilya from That Works would probably look at this and tell me it's a piece of crap, especially for my first one, I'm really, really proud of this thing, and I already can't wait to make another one. So this baby right here is my entry for the Samurai Challenge. Big thanks to Dennis Tyrell for organizing and spearheading the challenge. It's always a great honor to be invited. There will be links down below to all the participating channels, and there's some dudes doing some pretty cool stuff for this, so be sure to check out the videos. There will also be a link to a Google Doc where you can vote for your favorite one. But anyway, thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, all that jazz. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to stay up to date with the day-to-day goings-on here at the shop, Instagram is the best place. That's where I'm the most active. And as always, we're sponsored by Lazy K Knife Supply, so there's some discount codes in the description if you're looking to get your hands on some top-shelf handle material. But that ain't quite all I got for you, so don't go just yet. If you've ever wondered about the meaning behind my touch mark, you know, the Roman numeral 3 with the J and N on either side, my full name is John Howard Norwood III. My father, John Howard Norwood II, who a lot of you have met at Blade Show and hung out with in past years, well, this past July, after fighting a long battle with some really aggressive cancer, he passed away. So what I want to do with this sword is a charity build in his honor, and I want to donate all the proceeds to the American Cancer Society in his name. So same rules as every other charity build I've done. Slots are $10, buy as many as you want. You buy 2, your name goes on the list twice, this and that and the other. And the winner will be drawn at random on November 30th, 2023. That would have been his 68th birthday. I'd really like to say more, but I don't want to lose my composure. And if I sit here and start going off about what a great guy he was and everything, I'll just be here talking all day, and ain't none of us got time for that. So if you want to win the sword for $10 and you know, help raise money for a good cause, this is a chance to do it. That's all I got for you, and y'all take care.